I'd like to welcome everybody once again to the 232nd episode of the Minnesota Outdoor Skills and Stewardship Series. We have a really cool program today. This is, and Melissa, I got to say, this is one of my favorite photos because I've done a lot of fly fishing down the Whitewater Valley, and I'm very familiar with that bat box. And the time of year you got this photo is just awesome. So we're going to talk about bats today. And Melissa Bowman is part of the Minnesota Biological Survey. And welcome. I'm interested to hear all about bats today.
All right, thank you for the introduction. Um, as Benji said, my name is Melissa Bowman. I am a bat biologist with the Minnesota DNR. Specifically, my program is the Minnesota Biological Survey. Today, I'm going to be talking about how we use bat boxes and how we can actually improve this habitat for bats. So I do just want to give a brief background on all of our bat species before I jump into the ones that specifically use bat boxes. So in Minnesota, we have 8 different bat species. We tend to divide them into 2 different categories that I have here. On the left, we have our migratory bats. So these are bats that are present in Minnesota only in the spring, summer, and fall. During the winter, they migrate to areas with more mild climates like the southeastern US, and some of these species, like the hoary bat or silver-haired bat, may even go as far as Mexico for overwintering. The fourth species on this slide, the evening bat, is sort of a mystery bat. This is a new species to Minnesota as of 2016, when a female who was lactating was captured during mistnet surveys. This is a species that is likely moving north, so they are now being found in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, when previously they only ranged as far north as Iowa. Um, on the right side, we've got our 4 cave bats. So these bats are present in Minnesota throughout the entire year, spring, summer, fall, and winter. To survive the winter, they hibernate for beginning in usually about September, October, all the way until April, sometimes even May, depending on the spring weather. So 3 of these species, the northern long-eared bat, the tricolored bat, and the little brown bat, all have to go underground to hibernate. They need very specific temperature, very specific humidity. So these bats have to go into caves or mines to survive the winter. The fourth species, the big brown bat, is a common one in Minnesota, and they actually are able to overwinter in buildings. So whenever we hear about winter bat activity, it tends to be this species, the big brown bat. So you're probably noticing these purple circles on the big brown bat and little brown bat profiles, and that just indicates that these are the 2 species that are using bat boxes out of our 8 species. These 2 are both common building users. So like I said, big brown bats can overwinter in buildings, little browns cannot, but both of them can use buildings during the summer months. They will form maternity colonies during those periods. And both these species, as cave bats, are vulnerable to white nose syndrome. Now, the big brown bats, aside from trees or aside from buildings, they also use trees for roosts in the summer. Little brown bats apparently appear to rely exclusively on buildings or artificial habitat. We haven't really had recent observations of them forming maternity colonies in trees. Big brown bats are less vulnerable to white nose. Again, with their ability to hibernate in buildings, they can actually avoid white nose syndrome altogether since the disease originates from a fungus that thrives in cave systems. Unfortunately, little brown bats cannot avoid white nose syndrome because they have to hibernate in these caves. So they've been greatly impacted, and we've seen declines greater than 90% for most of our little brown bat populations that overwinter here. These declines occurred from about 2016 to 2019, so they happened very rapidly. As a result, the little brown is a very high conservation concern, and when we talk about bat boxes and how to use them to help bats, this is really the species that we're trying to target or trying to help by providing this summer habitat. Big brown bats seem to be common and seemingly abundant, so they seem to actually be doing okay. So it's really the little brown bat that we try to focus on. Now, I mentioned those two, but I do have an interesting observation of silver-haired bats in bat boxes. They aren't known to be a bat box user, but while I was conducting some research in 2021 and 2022, I observed this species using bat boxes for the first time in Minnesota. This is one species that we know very little about their summer roosting habits. They're likely to form small colonies in tree crevices, so they might be a species that lends to using bat boxes. Um, but again, there's been no reports that I've seen, and across the US, I've seen very minimal information about them using bat boxes. So this is a third species that we might be able to also help by installing bat boxes as summer habitat. So I mentioned maternity colonies. So what is a maternity colony? So this is a group of females that are gathered during the summer. Specifically, they're gathered to give birth to pups. They're for these species, the little brown bat, only a single pup is born to each mother during the summer. I think a lot of people see these numerous bats or see this group of bats and think that they're having a ton of babies at one time. But it's really not the case. They are slow reproducers, so these bats will only have one baby each summer. They seek very hot temps, so the preferred temperature for a colony is between 86 degrees and 104 Fahrenheit. So this is why bat colonies tend to congregate in attics in the summer, is because heat gets trapped in there and it's very warm. They seek these heat or these hot temperatures for their pups so that their pups can grow as quickly as possible. In cold temps, those pups are going to struggle to grow and they're going to use more energy to maintain a suitable body temperature. So the mothers will actually return to the same roost year after year. So these are really family groups that recognize a site as safe to have their pups, so they'll come back every year. The males don't roost in these groups. The males will actually roost by themselves. They'll be solo in what I call cool roosts, so roosts that don't get as hot. They like to use tree crevices. They like to be under loose bark. Sometimes they're in rock piles or talus slopes. Often they can tuck into patio umbrellas that are folded closed because it's a nice weatherproof space that doesn't get too hot. So those males are really separate from the females, roosting more singly or by themselves. So roost temperature, as I started to describe, is really important to bats for all sorts of reasons. So I kind of laid out a timeline here of what's going on during the seasons for bats. Um, Illustrating how important this temperature is. So if we start on the left in the winter, as we move towards spring, bats are in hibernation. They start to emerge as our spring temperatures get above freezing. And when temperatures are regularly in about 50 degrees Fahrenheit, then we start to see bats being active again on the summer landscape. So when females emerge from hibernation, they're very low on fat reserves. At the same time, pregnancy is beginning for those females as they emerge. They mate in the fall, but they store sperm and they fertilize in the spring. So they're using those very limited fat reserves to start this very energetically expensive journey of pregnancy. Pups will be born by mid June. Um, and then those pups are weaned in late July. So it's about 3 weeks until the pups start actually flying. So it's a very short window there. It's about a month from when those pups are born to when they start foraging for insects. But that whole time, they're dependent on mom for milk. By the time we get to the fall, bats are already preparing to go underground for, could be up to 7, 8 months. So those bats are trying to get as fat as possible and foraging as much as they can. Little brown bats will go underground as early as September. So we have basically from late July, early August into September that those pups have enough time to build up their fat reserves. And then, of course, hibernation depends on the winter, but those pups are going to be totally dependent on fat reserves that they accumulated to survive. So we know that spring temperatures affect fetus development. females can actually totally pause gestation or development of the pups when spring temperatures are too cold. Those females will go into torpor or a light hibernation mode, which essentially pauses the pregnancy. So spring temperatures affect the dates that pups are born. Again, pups depend on warm temperatures for development in the roost. So the faster they grow and are able to learn how to fly and forage, the more able they are to build up enough fat reserves to make it through hibernation. So when it comes down to it, roosts can impact reproductive success, which is really important for populations, and it also can impact winter survival. And this is really important in the context of white nose syndrome, where we tend to have bats succumbing to the disease and dying um, due to not having enough fat reserves to survive that sort of disruption. So bats exhibit different behaviors at different roost types. And I think this is good to illustrate just because a lot of folks who have had bats in buildings know that those bats return every year, and it may be multiple years that you're, either working on excluding bats from a building or that you recognize they're there. So when bats are using buildings, they do not switch roosts at all. They will come to that roost in the springtime. They'll stay there until the fall when they start to disband for hibernation, but they're not moving to different buildings. This is because of the thermal qualities of a building. So with high thermal mass, temperatures are stable in a building. You also have very large temperature gradients where you can have bats. Essentially being at the hottest point of the house in the attic where it's super hot, or they can crawl down to get cooler temperatures as they move down the wall. So this large space essentially allows many individuals to roost here, allows them to select temperatures that they're looking for. So they don't need to move to different roosts throughout the summer. However, when we look at a natural scenario, like a tree roost. And this photo here is showing a tree roost where we tracked northern long-eared bats to. They tend to still use tree roosts. They tend to be in smaller colonies than the little brown bats who prefer building roosts. That's why I have that logo there with the little brown bat and the hearts, because they just love buildings. They love to be in big colonies. That seems to be most beneficial for their pups versus northerns implement a different strategy. So the northern long-eared bat, who primarily depends on tree roosts, they switch roosts almost daily. So that means even when they have their pups, they will carry their pups and move them to different trees almost nightly. This is because trees have a much lower thermal mass when you think of a building, which is going to be more stable, and those temperatures fluctuate with the ambient air temperature a lot. Um, Bats tend to pick solar exposed roosts so that there's some temperature gradient or there's some warmer temperatures available, but overall that temperature gradient is going to be much smaller than what's available in a building. And then again, it's a much smaller roosting area, so there's a limited number of individuals that can fit within one tree roost. As a result, they switch daily. I put the bat box icon there because the bat box is really going to be acting more like a tree roost with lower thermal mass, more fluctuation in temperature than a building. And this is why we have come up with new recommendations for how to actually use bat boxes. So over, I believe, 2021 to 2024, we conducted a study with Parks and Trails where we looked at all bat boxes that were installed in parks statewide, looked at where we had maternity colonies using bat boxes and essentially where we didn't have bats using boxes. The first key observation that came out is that when you have just a single bat box, you don't tend to attract a maternity colony. Maybe you get a single bat that will use it once in a while, but again, those solo males don't really have the same habitat needs that the maternity colonies have, given that they can roost in so many different locations. So when we're using bat boxes, we're really targeting the maternity colony that need some choices and variety to essentially select the right microclimate that they need for their pup based on what's happening with the ambient air temperature. So choices are really important for these maternity colonies. The graphic here is just illustrating what an ideal setup might look like for a homeowner, which may look like a lot to some folks, but you can definitely build this up over time. You don't have to like, get everything set up and have it perfect with all your bat boxes for bats to start using it. Some of the key recommendations that we have is to use multiple bat boxes in a cluster formation. So this is what the graphic is depicting. And a cluster is essentially a number of bat boxes that are within sight distance from each other. So you don't want them so far where the bats don't recognize this as a roost network, but you don't want them so close where I guess there's no variety within the cluster, I guess. So when you use multiple boxes, you can also orient them to face different solar aspects. So in the springtime, an east facing box is really important to get that morning sun and get that warmth as soon as possible after a cold night. Um, it may be less important in late summer when temperatures are very hot and the bats actually want to start spreading out. So that's why we recommend to have multiple boxes and face them different solar exposures so the bats can again choose that microclimate. Um, we recommend to place boxes in open areas near forests. We recommend avoid placing boxes directly on trees, and that's just because boxes are often too shaded. Again, we want warm temperatures, but sometimes when they're put on trees, they get too much shade and the bats don't really like to use them. It can also make bats vulnerable to predators. So snakes, raccoons, things like that have easier time accessing a box that's on a tree versus one that might be on a post or the side of a building. You want somewhat open areas. You don't want too much clutter around the bat boxes because bats need clearance to be able to drop out of the bat box. So we recommend that if you do put bat boxes, make sure you keep vegetation below short enough that it won't grow up and interfere with the bat box. We recommend at least 12 to 15 feet above the ground or the tallest vegetation, just to give that flight path clearance. And that's really important to bats because if they can't access the entrance or leave freely, then they probably won't use the structure either. Um, Another important feature to think about when installing boxes is the distance from water. So bats, when they leave roost at night, they will almost always go immediately to a water source and drink before they start foraging. The image here is just depicting a bat skimming over a pond drinking water. So they have to drink in flight. So it's good if you can get your boxes installed less than a quarter mile from water sources. Thankfully, in Minnesota, we have so many water resources around us that this usually isn't too much of an issue for folks to um, find a water source to kind of focus the boxes around. And then another thing that's important to note is that these boxes are really valuable for bats that are in buildings that need to be excluded. So if you want to remove bats from your house, absolutely understandable. You can do an exclusion, but if you want to keep them around, you can put up these bat boxes as a way to provide alternative habitat for them. Um, the image here is depicting three different designs that we recommend. So I'll talk about those here. We've got one that we call a Johnson box, and this is a design that actually originated in Minnesota with a DNR area wildlife manager out of Detroit Lakes. His name is Earl. So he created this design, and we see that bats love it. Where we found this design in state parks, a lot of bats used them. It's very similar to the multi-chamber nursery, which essentially is just a square box with multiple chambers that the bats can roost in. The main difference between the Johnson and the multi-chamber is just the orientation of the chambers. So the Johnson has them running side to side, where the multi-chamber has them front to back. Bats love both of these structures. So they're both easy to build, easy to use. What I like the most about them is you can put them back to back on a structure. So you can have one that faces east and one that faces west. And that is a way to provide choices for the bats. Um, on the right side, we have a two-chamber rocket box. This is a really unique design that I also love. It essentially allows bats to access all four sides of that bat box. So it's chambers built around the post rather than chambers built in succession within the bat box. Um, this design is also very tall, so it allows for a great temperature gradient with heat rising at the top and then cooler temperatures or more ambient temperatures near the bottom. So within this single bat box, bats have a lot of choices. Um, just as a side note, when I was doing my monitoring of the structures of the rocket boxes, when I would check in the morning, I would see bats on the east side, and when I would check in the evening, they might be on the north, the west, or the south side, but it was always in the morning they moved over to the east side. So that's one cool thing about that design. It does take a little bit more work or a little bit more materials to build compared to the Johnson or the multi-chamber box. But it's a fun woodworking project. So if you have interest in that one, just know it's a little bit more involved than the other two. Those plans are available on our website, and we'll give links at the end of this as well where you can access more information about those designs. Just a couple building tips if you do decide to build your own bat box. Um, some common wood types that folks use are pine, oak, or cedar. There's no bad wood type except pressure or chemically treated wood. I think we just want to avoid as much as we can chemicals for the bats. Again, they're roosting in here for the entire summer, so we just want to reduce exposure to materials that may not be good for the bats. The exterior boards should be at least 1/2 inch thick just to provide longevity, but you can use plywood for the interior partitions. So you can use as small as 1/4 inch plywood. Um, when you create these cavities or these partitions for the bats, you want to scour or roughen the boards so that bats can hold on. We recommend to avoid using mesh or net screen because those can tear through time and actually trap pups, or they can trap guano and debris that should be falling out of the box. So just use the rough wood texture for the for bats to be able to grip in there. To weatherproof it, we really want to make sure that water is not leaking in. Bats will avoid structures that, have water inside. So make sure you caulk the seams with adhesive or caulk, just kind of seal them off. And then use weatherproof screws instead of nails. Over time, the wood may warp and the nails may pop out, creating gaps that let water or cold air in. So the screws really help keep those boxes more intact than nails. When you paint your bat boxes, only paint the exterior and try to use non-toxic paint or stain if you can. You can choose a dark brown to a light brown shade. We used to recommend paint boxes black because, again, we want them to be hot, but we have learned that boxes have potential to overheat. This is particularly true for west facing boxes that are painted black. And that's because that box will be in the sun all day. It'll be absorbing more heat as the sun starts to set in the west. So we recommend to avoid west facing boxes being black. So it's just good to go with a light to dark brown shade just to kind of prevent potential for overheating there. Other modification options to consider when you build your own is to increase the volume. So we see that large volume bat boxes are the most beneficial. Um, Again, when I talk about these designs here, I'm talking about multi-chamber boxes. Often you will see for sale single chamber bat boxes, and those are not effective for bats. They rarely house them, again, related to temperature. But you can increase the volume on any of these plans by adding additional chambers. The difficulty is just going to be how heavy does your box get as you make it extra large. You can add 1.5-inch diameter holes to the interior partitions, and that allows bats to move between those chambers front to back without having to come out of the bat box. As these designs exist now, I'll go back to the slide, but you see the chambers run all the way to the top. So when bats need to move to different sides, they have to come down and come out here. So if you add those diameter holes, it just allows easier travel through the bat box. Keep in mind that extra large boxes should have vents just to allow for some airflow. And then your chamber widths should be about 3/4 inch to 1 inch max. The Johnson plans advocate for a 1 inch chamber width, but you can adjust that as well. But the 3/4 inch is really valuable for the little brown bats. They like to be pretty tucked in there. So when you're choosing a location to place boxes, I think it's important to note that boxes do not replace trees. They do not replace when you cut down a forest, for example, you can't replace that habitat with bat boxes. They are really meant to be used for bats that use buildings like the little brown bat. So when you do an exclusion, think about putting bat boxes if you can to provide that alternate habitat and to still benefit from the pest control that bats provide. I put these pictures here just showing some good locations. Again, water resources are great. So wherever you've got rivers, lakes, and ponds. This area is showing again the group site at Whitewater, where we have had bats using those cabins in the past, but they've put up bat boxes to provide alternative habitats and have had great success keeping the bats out of the cabins there. But this area just shows, like an open forested area is a great location. And then I put a picture of Bloomington here at the end because I also think urban areas are very important for considering bat box installations. These urban areas, especially Minneapolis, St. Paul, where we've got these big river systems and great kind of green habitat around, can be really beneficial because those urban areas are likely where bats are being excluded most often and kind of bumping from house to house looking for a roost that they can occupy long term. So I really like to promote bat boxes for urban park settings. Stewardship is really important for boxes. So the picture here on the left is just showing an example of, I believe it was honeysuckle that ended up overgrowing one of these bat boxes that, is about 10 feet off the ground. So it's really important that you manage vegetation long term so that these boxes don't get crowded. When we did the inventory with state parks, we also found boxes that had fallen over on the ground. Um, it's important that you recognize these structures may only last 10 years or so before they need any maintenance or, the veg needs maintenance before 10 years. But it's just important to note that when we put up bat boxes, we're putting up long-term habitat that these females will come back to every year. So it's not sort of a put up one and you're done situation. It's more think about being a steward for your bat boxes. Another issue we commonly see is that wasps will also occupy bat boxes. Um, the bats don't have a problem with this. They get along just fine. They seem to avoid each other within the box. But over time, those wasp nests can start to build up and take over the top of the bat box. And that's where bats like to roost, is mostly at the top. So if you get a wasp nest that covers the entire um, width of your bat box, bats are probably going to stop using it because they can't get where they like to be in the box. So it's just important that you clean out those nests. You don't have to do any sort of chemical control because, again, we want to avoid chemicals for bats. Um, but when the wasps leave in the winter, all you got to do is take like a little paintbrush or a pole and just try to clean out those nests. So part of stewardship for your bat boxes also involves monitoring your colony. The best way to monitor bat boxes is by conducting evening emergence counts. So this is where you sit at sunset, as this photo is showing one of our volunteers who has helped us count bat boxes in one of our state parks. You sit at sunset, You wait for the bats to start emerging. This picture is showing an example of one bat dropping out, and then you just start counting as the bats start flying out. We recommend to do it 2 times during the summer to capture sort of 2 different groups. So in early June, remember I mentioned that the pups are born in June. Um, this is before they're flying. So when we do a count in early June, we're really counting the reproductive adults in the colony. So we're counting the moms as they come out to forage. When we conduct a count by mid-late July, once those pups start flying, then we're counting the adults and the pups, and that gives us a sense of how reproduction is going within that bat box. When we combine those counts throughout multiple years, we can actually see how much the population is growing. Um, and that tells us how well our bats are doing. So with white nose syndrome, I mentioned we've seen 90% declines in our cave habitat during the winter months, but we are finally starting to see some positive observations at our summer colonies where we're starting to see growth. At a couple of our state parks, we had about 500 bats last year roosting, sorry, 2024. And then last year in 2025, those counts bumped up to 700 bats. So that was great to see this 200 bat increase, which maybe represents the pups that survived over the winter coming back to reproduce in the roost that they were born in. Um, so the evening emergent counts are a really fun way to interact with bat colonies, and they really provide important data for us to understand how they're doing for recovery. With that said, we are launching a new community science program. So this is in partnership with MBS, the organization I'm a part of, and then also the non-game community science program. What we're doing is implementing these bat counts statewide. So we're hoping to recruit landowners who have a bat roost. So if you do have a bat roost that you know of, even if they're in a building that you're planning to exclude, um, count 2 times per summer and report your results. If you don't have a bat roost, we are looking for volunteers to help us count public roosts at state parks. We are working on the sort of the sign up forms for that right now, but I do have this QR code to our bat observation report. So if you have a colony, you can report it at this link. You can let me know if you're interested in monitoring, and I can follow up and make sure that we get you the resources. If you're interested in volunteering, I have my email address on the next slide. But anyone who has a bat roost, regardless if you plan to keep it in your building, if you're going to do an exclusion, if you got a bat box that doesn't have bats in it, you can still use this observation report line and I can connect with you. Another part of the community science that we'll be doing is also acoustic monitoring. So we'll be looking for volunteers to place acoustic detectors, which listen to bat calls. Um, we can identify those calls to species, so that gives us information about what bats are in your area. Um, we're particularly looking for folks in northern and western Minnesota. We get a lot of folks from the metro area, but we're hoping to distribute these efforts statewide. Um, I put a link here to the non-game community science program. You can just Google them. They've got other programs like the Frog and Toad survey. I think they have a Swift survey, so you can go in there and kind of see what other efforts they are doing. Okay, and then all the information I talked about today about bat boxes, things to consider when you install them, the links to the designs, all of that is in this guide to artificial roost for bats. I'm really proud of this publication we put together last year and released for this sort of information to send out to the public. So you can access that via the QR code or the short URL there. Um, I also wrote an article for the Minnesota Conservation Volunteer about bat boxes, so there's a lot more information there if you're interested, and that's in the September-October 2025 issue, so you can just Google that to find the Better Bat Boxes article. I've got a QR code here for our bats webpage. There's a lot of resources there, including the artificial roost guide. There's also info about bats in buildings, about all of our species in Minnesota. And then again, that bat observation report link is there. I'll also say just check out, be on the lookout for bat events. As we do these counts in state parks, more of them are starting to offer programming that you can just come out and attend a bat program and catch a good sunset, watch some bats emerge. And then every year we also put on the Minnesota Bat Festival. It's usually the last weekend in October to correspond with Bat Week, which is the last week in October. And often we do it in Bloomington, but we're hoping to eventually start rotating around the state with that festival. And then if you have, very specific questions, if you're interested in maybe doing the acoustic monitoring, I have my email here. So with that, I think I can open it up to questions. And I'll just leave this resources page up for a minute in case folks want to access those.
Great, Melissa. Thanks for all that great, wonderful information. So it's always good to catch up on how bats are doing in Minnesota. So appreciate that.
Hmm.
Ed had a comment in here, having built both styles of bat boxes he's talking about, the Johnson box is easier to construct than the multi-chamber nursery, especially if you don't have a table saw. So
Perfect. Yep. Thanks for that comment, Ed. And that's one cool thing about the Johnson box is that the way it was designed was meant to be to make it the most simple, the minimal cuts you need using just, I think, two pieces of rough sawn wood. So they're often like thicker. So thanks for that comment because that is good to know that that's a lot easier than the multi-chamber.
and some of these, for those of you that work with like Boy Scout groups or Cub Scouts or any of that stuff, to have somebody cut all those pieces out and have the kids assemble boxes that they can take home is always a kind of a cool project and a kind of a fun thing to do. So always recommend doing that. Um, Doreen was asking a question, which bats enter homes or structures and become problematic for building owners?
Yeah, so that is I'll go back to this slide here. That is the big brown and the little brown bat. These two. Since white nose syndrome has moved through the state, it most commonly is the big brown bat that people encounter in their house. And I will just say about bats in buildings, a lot of people panic when they learn that they have bats and they think it's an infestation, like an infestation of mice. But bats cannot chew or create their own openings. The issue is really that you've got a house that's been weathered enough that there's gaps that bats have found. So by doing an exclusion where you put up a one-way exit device, eventually the bats leave, and then you seal up those weathered locations. That's the solution for getting those bats out.
It's good to know. Uh, Dan asked, do you recommend putting pup nets under boxes?
Yeah, so you definitely can because that is something that happens on occasion is that pups will drop out of the bat box or get knocked out of the bat box. Again, these are vertical structures that just drop straight down so that guano and other stuff can fall out. But you can put a pup catcher, which essentially would be just a frame around the post that has netting or something that the bats would land on. The mother bats will actually pick up their pups um, from those pup catchers. So you don't have to go and like physically put one back in the box, but the mothers will often come and pick them up.
Interesting. I have not seen those before, so that's good to know. Lacey had a question. If you are not near a water source, is there any value to putting up a bat box?
Yes, I think that there still can be value. I think the biggest thing is there a colony nearby that might need assistance?
Okay.
Um, So in agricultural lands, like near barns and stuff, often bat colonies are there. So you can still put it up. Bats will likely still find it. It's just the most benefit when they don't have to travel very far to find water.
My friend Amber, hi Amber, has a great question here. Is there a protocol for safe handling of boxes when repairs are needed, respirator, gloves, etc.? Is it a good or bad idea to try to clean them or leave the guano residue, etc., where it is?
Yeah, great question. So typically for maintenance of boxes, if you are taking a box down that just needs some extra caulking or sealing, um, I would just make sure you're wearing gloves because there is going to be a lot of guano in the bat box and some bat urine and stuff. So make sure you wear gloves. Make sure you wear a respirator, like an N95 mask is sufficient as well. You just kind of want something to prevent anything that's aerosolized from breathing that in. Um, Typically, we're not cleaning out bat boxes. It's more about those structures being weatherproofed. So just making sure that the structure is good enough for bats. Um, One thing to note is that boxes do contain bat bugs, which are parasites of bats. They're similar to bed bugs. They look very similar to bed bugs. So I'd recommend you do not bring a bat box that has been used by bats in an inside space. I think always work with it outside. If you can, just, near the post if you're going to put it right back up. If a box is going to be replaced, I would just maybe put it in a pile for burning later, to dispose of that box just because there is animal matter and those potential parasites in there. So I think just disposing of it, you can burn it or you can. I wouldn't recycle the wood to use for anything else.
Good information. So, similar to that, Rachel has a question. How much guano typically comes out of bat boxes? Is it safe to have a back box in the same backyard that children play in?
Yeah, great question. So typically I recommend, like in this picture showing here, like it's in this front yard, which can work, but I would recommend that it's off areas where people are walking. You don't want it to be where people are going to be directly below the box often because guano does fall out of the box. And again, we heard pups can occasionally fall out. So you don't necessarily want them in a place where children are going to be playing or where they might, have unsupervised access to the box. Um, the guano pile can accumulate if you've got, 100 bats in a box, it'll be a noticeable mound below the bat box. So typically I recommend, like the best case scenario is a situation like this where you've got a bat box in a field or somewhere that is being restored with native grasses, native flowers, all that stuff, because the guano is a great fertilizer. So it's great to have a garden below versus just open grass where people are maybe directly walking or playing below the box.
Great. Peter asks, how do you keep woodpeckers from damaging bat boxes?
I don't often see woodpeckers damaging boxes, and I think that's just because there's not typically grubs or things that they're foraging for in those bat boxes. So I haven't seen too many interactions with woodpeckers and bat boxes. But if you have that observation, I would love to hear about it and what your experience was. So you can email me um, there because I am interested in those stories.
I'm guessing you might have a cedar-sided house that decoy. He wants to make a decoy for the woodpeckers, maybe.
Oh, yeah.
Judy has a great question here. She lives on a runoff pond that the pond association treats for algae and duckweed. Should I avoid putting bat boxes around there, being that it's treated?
That's a great question. I don't think that that would necessarily be a sink for the bats. Um, I do think that there are probably a lot of people that are treating their ponds where bats are around, right? Um, so I wouldn't say no, but I also would say like maybe that is a point of caution to note of like how does the treatment of this specific thing affect other animals in the ecosystem that might be drinking from that water source. Um, So I guess the jury's out on that one. You could, but I wouldn't say like, no, don't do that, I guess.
Okay. Another question about how to best rough up the interior boards. is just a rough sandpaper, or do you need something more aggressive to make deeper grooves?
Yeah, you do want to make some deeper grooves. So often people use scouring tools to just or a sander using the edge of the sander to really carve out just some deep grooves in there. Um, Basically, if you just kind of do like an S pattern back and forth across a partition, that's usually enough to provide some grip. So they don't have to be like crazy, but even like the rough sawn lumber has more texture that bats are able to grip versus something that is smoothly sanded down. And the plywood can be kind of rough sometimes too. So you can um, just try to get some grooves in there, some noticeable grooves.
Have your youngster dig out the Dremel tool and draw some bat pictures on there
Yeah. Yeah,
would
the
help.
Dremel tool. Yep. Mhm.
Doreen was asking about rabies. How prevalent is rabies in bats?
Yeah, so bats have a bad rap when it comes to rabies. I think a lot of people think if they see a bat, it's probably rabid. In general, less than 1% of the population is carrying rabies at a given time. And just for context, in Minnesota, of the bats that are submitted for rabies testing, only 3 to 4% generally test positive. Um, so the the likelihood that a bat has rabies or that you've got a bat colony where there's multiple individuals with rabies is very low. But because rabies is a disease that we want to be very careful with, we're very cautious about what happens if you handle a bat, if you think you may have been bit by a bat, if you wake up in a room if you were sleeping in a room where a bat was flying, we always recommend that you submit those bats for rabies testing, maybe visit your physician if needed. Um, so it's low, but we always just be cautious with how we interact with bats and any other rabies vector species.
Precaution is always good. Um, Madison asked, um, or Felicia, sorry, is it advised to mount bat box on a house or garage if you're in the cities, or do you recommend some other mounting space?
No, you definitely can. I think the main thing is just to keep in mind what's going on below the bat box. So you may get some guano that sticks to your siding as it drops out of the box. You may get, a guano pile. You definitely don't want to put a bat box over like a doorway that you're going to be coming and going because you don't want to be walking below bats constantly. Um, you kind of want to put it in an area that gets very little traffic. So maybe the side of a garage that people don't really walk on. Um, I will say bats love boxes that are installed on buildings because they have even better thermal qualities than a box that's just on a post by itself. It benefits from the temp stability of a building. So just be mindful of what's going on below the bat box. How frequently are you walking over there? Um, that's just the important thing to consider.
Great. And Dan had one other question on here. Does the DNR have recommended bat box sales sites? I know we have plans out there, but I don't know if places actually sell them or not.
Yeah, so there are just a couple sites. So I like to mention Bat Conservation and Management. They're a company that sells bat boxes that are suitable for bats. I think it's really important to know if you just,
Oh, I think we lost you there, Melissa. Nope, can't hear you. Well, we're just about out of time anyway, so we'll see if she gets her audio working, but I still don't hear you. So I would like to remind everybody that next week or in 2 weeks, we'll have episode 233, which is Learning to Hunt in a New World. Our Hmong outreach specialist, May Vang, is going to join us and talk about um, Hmong immigrants that have come here to Minnesota and learn how to hunt in Minnesota. And it should be a very interesting topic. So hopefully you'll join us in a couple weeks. And I also want to remind everybody that all these episodes are recorded just like today, and we put them on our website at mndnr.gov/discover. So if you missed a little bit of the start of today's webinar, please feel free to join that, or if you want to share it with others, have them send them a link to it. So, Melissa, were you able to get your speaker working again? Doesn't sound like it. Still can't hear you. So
Okay.
there
Nope.
you are.
Oh, okay. Nope. Oh, here I am. Am I here?
You're here. Yep.
Okay. Sorry about that.
No problem. So I'll let you stop your presentation there if you want. And
Yep.
you were just talking about bat boxes. What was the name of the company that you can actually buy bat boxes from, you said?
Yep. So that's Bat Conservation and Management. So they've got boxes that are actually suitable for bats. My main thing is that I recommend you avoid single chamber boxes, things that are on the shelf at Menards or Home Depot, anything that's, really small. Because again, it's multi-chamber boxes that the bats prefer.
Okay. Great. Thank you again for joining us. Thanks everybody out there for joining us. Hopefully you come back and join us again and share the recordings with your friends and colleagues out there. So Melissa, if we decide to go out and build bat boxes here in the next few weeks, what's the best time of the year to put them out?
Anytime.
Anytime?
Yep, as long as the ground isn't frozen and you can get a post in, anytime. I do think that bats start looking for roosts at the end of summer. So we often think put them up in the spring before bats emerge, but I think they do most of their roost exploring in the late summer. So if you can get them up by June, July, they'll start exploring in August, September, and maybe then the next summer they'll move into the bat box.
Great information. Yeah, it's a pleasure as always. I hope everybody out there has a chance to get out and do some community science. I think it's a really cool idea to get out and count bats or do some acoustic survey stuff. So it's a lot of fun and it helps us out. It's a really cool experience for people. So I think with that, we'll stop the recording.